Hey everyone. I've been debating whether or not to post this, but I need to get it off my chest. Last weekend, my friends and I, Mike, Laura, Jenna, and Tom, decided to explore an old amusement park that's been abandoned for decades. It's one of those places that's surrounded by urban legends and stories of people disappearing. But we thought we'd be fine. Just a bunch of teenagers looking for thrills, right? We arrived at the park just after dusk. The sun was setting, and the place was even creepier than I'd imagined. The gates were rusted and barely hanging on their hinges. We had to squeeze through a gap to get inside. The once bright colors of the rides had long since faded to eerie shades of gray, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. At first, we laughed and joked about how ridiculous the stories were. It was just an old park after all. We walked through the main entrance and started exploring. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like a skeletal giant, and the carousel was a ghostly ring of faded horses. Everything was still and silent except for the occasional creak of rusted metal. As we wandered deeper into the park, the air grew colder. Laura was the first to notice it. She shivered and suggested we check out the funhouse. We all agreed, partly because we wanted to see if there was anything genuinely spooky, and partly because it was getting darker, and we were looking for shelter. The funhouse was a decrepit building with a sign that read "Mirror Maze." The windows were shattered and the door was ajar. We hesitated for a moment before pushing inside. The interior was just as you'd expect. Mirrors everywhere, some cracked and others fogged up with age. It was disorienting, and the reflections seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. We started to explore, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced at a mirror, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. We made our way through the maze, laughing nervously and calling out to each other. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl. It echoed through the funhouse, sending shivers down my spine. We all stopped and looked at each other. Confusion and fear etched on our faces. Probably just an animal, Mike suggested, but none of us were convinced. We pressed on, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But then, things started to get really weird. The mirrors began to distort our reflections, showing us things that didn't quite match up with reality. Laura's reflection looked like it was grinning maniacally, and Tom's reflection seemed to be moving independently of him. It wasn't long before we realized we were completely lost. The mirrors seemed to be shifting, rearranging themselves and trapping us in a nightmarish version of the funhouse. We tried to find an exit, but every turn we took led us deeper into the maze. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and we could hear it coming from all directions. Panic set in. Jenna started to scream and we all rushed to find her. But the moment we did, the mirrors began to crack and shatter, and the floor beneath us trembled. It felt like the whole funhouse was alive, trying to swallow us whole. We scrambled to escape, but the maze had become a living nightmare. The growling grew closer and the reflections in the mirrors began to take on a more sinister, menacing quality. We had to find a way out before it was too late. We stumbled through the maze, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The growling had become a constant presence, reverberating through the mirrored walls and making it impossible to determine where it was coming from. The air was thick with fear and every sound seemed amplified in the confined space. We finally reached an open area of the funhouse that looked like it might be an exit. The mirrors here were cracked and broken, their jagged edges creating strange, distorted reflections. We were hopeful that this might be our way out. Laura was the first to notice something strange. "Guys, where's Jenna?" she asked, her voice trembling. We all turned to look, and Jenna was nowhere to be seen. "Jenna!" we shouted, but there was no response. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Panic surged through us as we realized that she could have gotten separated from us in the chaos. Tom tried to calm us down. "We need to stay together and find her. We can't afford to get split up." But as we began to move again, it became clear that the funhouse was playing tricks on us. The layout seemed to change with each step, and the walls of mirrors were warping and shifting in ways that defied logic. Suddenly, Mike let out a scream. We turned to see him staring at a mirror with wide, terrified eyes. "It's not just reflections," he yelled. "Something's moving in there." We rushed over and saw what he meant. The reflection in the mirror was different from the real world. It showed a dark, shadowy figure moving behind us. It was as if the mirror was a gateway to another world, a world where something malevolent was lurking. Let's keep moving, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to find Jenna and get out of here before things get worse. As we continued, the growling grew louder and more aggressive. The mirrors started to crack more frequently, sending shards of glass raining down around us. We could hear Jenna's voice faintly calling out for help, but it was distorted and coming from different directions. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. Then, without warning, the floor beneath us gave way. We fell into a lower level of the funhouse, landing in a heap on a dusty, uneven floor. It was darker down here, and the air was filled with an oppressive, stifling feeling. We tried to get up and assess our surroundings. The walls here were covered in strange, graffiti-like markings. Some of them looked like symbols or warnings, but they were too faded to read clearly. The growling was now a constant, echoing roar that seemed to be coming from all around us. In the dim light, we saw something that made our blood run cold. There were footprints on the floor, large humanoid prints that seemed to lead toward a narrow passageway. "We have to follow these," Tom said, his voice trembling. "They might lead us to Jenna." We hesitated for a moment, but the urgency of finding Jenna and escaping the maze pushed us forward. We followed the footprints down the passageway, which was getting narrower and more claustrophobic. The growling was growing louder and more intense, as if whatever was pursuing us was getting closer. We rounded a corner and came face to face with a door. It was old and heavy, with strange, rusted chains hanging from it. We could hear Jenna's voice clearly now, pleading for help on the other side. We tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. Desperation set in as we tried to force the door open. The growling was almost deafening now, and the door began to shake violently. It felt like something was trying to break through from the other side. Finally, the chains broke and the door swung open. But what we saw on the other side was not what we had hoped for. The room was empty, except for a large, gaping hole in the floor. Jenna's voice had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. It felt like the funhouse was taunting us, luring us deeper into its nightmarish trap. Our relief at breaking through the door was short-lived. The room beyond was a nightmare in itself, an empty void with a massive hole in the center. The silence was heavy and oppressive, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. "Jenna," we called out, but there was no response. The only sound was the distant thunderous growling that continued to echo through the walls of the maze. Tom peered cautiously into the hole. "It looks like a pit," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she fell in?" Before anyone could answer, the growling intensified, vibrating through the floor and causing loose debris to tumble into the pit. The sound was so loud that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. We had no choice but to move quickly, searching for another way out. We backed away from the hole and started to look around the room. The walls were adorned with more of those strange symbols, their meanings still unclear. The oppressive feeling in the air was getting worse, making it hard to breathe. Laura's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to keep moving," she said. "We can't stay here. We need to find Jenna and get out before whatever's making that noise finds us." We agreed and started to explore the rest of the room. It was like a forgotten basement, dusty, cluttered with old carnival equipment, and filled with a strange, sour smell. The growling seemed to come from all around us now, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. As we moved deeper into the room, we came across an old rickety staircase leading further down. It looked unstable, but it seemed to be the only option. With no other leads, we decided to descend. The staircase creaked and groaned under our weight, each step echoing through the dark. We tried to stay as quiet as possible, but the noise seemed to follow us, growing louder with each step. The growling was almost deafening now, and it felt like it was coming from right behind us. We reached the bottom of the stairs and found ourselves in what appeared to be an underground tunnel. The walls were damp and covered in mold, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. We followed the tunnel, the growling becoming almost unbearable. It was so loud that it felt like it was vibrating through our bones. We kept calling out for Jenna, but there was still no response. After what felt like hours, we finally saw a faint light up ahead. We rushed toward it, hoping it would lead us to an exit. But as we got closer, the light revealed itself to be a series of flickering, malfunctioning bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The tunnel opened into another large room, this one filled with old carnival games and abandoned prize booths. The light from the bulbs cast strange, flickering shadows on the walls, making it hard to see clearly. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of light and the distant growling. We cautiously stepped into the room, trying to make sense of our surroundings. The growling seemed to be coming from every direction now, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift unnaturally. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the growling becoming a deafening roar. We could barely see our hands in front of our faces, and the oppressive feeling in the air grew even stronger. We huddled together, trying to calm our racing hearts. The growling was now a cacophony of snarls and roars, and we could feel a presence moving around us in the darkness. It was like we were being surrounded by something unseen, something malevolent. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted from the ceiling, and we were momentarily blinded. When the light faded, we saw that the room had changed. The carnival games and prize booths were gone, replaced by twisted, nightmarish versions of themselves. The walls were covered in grotesque, nightmarish imagery, and the air was filled with a rancid stench. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie, almost mocking silence. We were completely disoriented, and it was clear that whatever was haunting the funhouse had become even more malevolent. We had no choice but to press on, hoping that we could find Jenna and escape this twisted version of the amusement park before it was too late. We hesitated at the threshold of the transformed room, our breaths coming in short, anxious bursts. The carnival games had taken on a grotesque quality, familiar shapes and colors twisted into horrific parodies of their former selves. A once cheerful ring toss game now had rusted metal rings that seemed to drip with a dark, viscous substance. A shooting gallery was filled with unsettlingly lifelike targets, their eyes seemingly following us as we moved. Our flashlight flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the room. The stench of decay was overpowering, and every breath felt heavy with dread. The growling had faded into a sinister silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old carnival equipment. Laura, who had been clutching her flashlight with white-knuckled intensity, let out a terrified gasp. "Look!" She pointed at a large, decrepit claw machine in the corner. The glass was shattered, and inside, amidst the dust and debris, we could see a twisted, decayed teddy bear. But what really caught our attention were the eyes of the bear. They were disturbingly human. Tom swallowed hard. "This is getting worse. We need to stay focused and keep moving." We pressed on, determined to find Jenna and escape the nightmare. As we walked, we noticed that the air seemed to grow colder, and our breaths became visible, puffing out in foggy clouds. The flickering lights overhead cast unsettling patterns on the walls, making it difficult to discern what was real and what was a trick of the light. We reached a section of the room with a series of old funhouse mirrors. Unlike the mirrors we had seen earlier, these were warped and cracked in a way that made the reflections appear as distorted, nightmarish figures. Each mirror seemed to show us not as we were, but as grotesque, exaggerated versions of ourselves. Mike, trying to keep his voice steady, said, "Let's split up and check these mirrors. Maybe there's a clue or a way out hidden here." We reluctantly agreed and began to search. As I walked past one mirror, I caught a glimpse of a figure behind me in the reflection. It was Jenna. At least it looked like Jenna. Her reflection was staring directly at me with wide, terrified eyes. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror, but the reflection was gone. "Jenna!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. I moved to another mirror and saw something even more horrifying. My reflection was no longer just a distorted version of me. It was a monstrous, grotesque figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It reached out toward me, its movements mirroring my own but with a sinister intent. The others were also finding disturbing things. Laura's reflection was trapped behind the glass, banging on it as if trying to escape. Tom's reflection was grinning maniacally, its laughter echoing through the room despite the lack of sound. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out again, plunging us into darkness. The growling returned, louder and more insistent than before. It felt like it was right behind us, closing in with every second. We huddled together, our breaths coming fast and shallow. A cold, slimy sensation brushed against my arm, and I flinched away, trying to see what it was. The room seemed to be closing in around us, the walls pulsating with a sickly, unnatural rhythm. The growling grew more intense, and we could feel the presence of something malevolent moving through the shadows. In the pitch blackness, Laura screamed, "It's getting closer!" We need to get out of here now. We stumbled through the room, trying to find an exit. The mirrors seemed to twist and shift, creating a disorienting maze. Every turn felt like it led us deeper into the nightmare. Just as we were about to lose hope, a glimmer of light appeared at the far end of the room. It was a faint, flickering glow, and it seemed to offer a way out. We dashed toward it, pushing through the darkness and the oppressive silence. As we reached the light, we found ourselves in a new room, this one even more twisted than the last. The walls were covered in strange, shifting patterns, and the air was filled with a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. We were exhausted, terrified, and no closer to finding Jenna. But there was no time to rest. The growling was louder than ever, and we knew we had to keep moving or risk becoming part of the nightmare ourselves. We entered the new room, and it was clear that whatever had twisted the funhouse into its nightmarish form was taking its malevolent artistry to the next level. The walls were adorned with shifting patterns that seemed to dance and writhe under the flickering light. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, synchronized with our pounding hearts. In the center of the room was a decrepit carousel. Unlike any carousel we'd seen before, this one was adorned with figures that defied description. They were neither horses nor animals, but grotesque, distorted shapes with eyes that seemed to follow us as we moved. The carousel spun slowly, creaking and groaning as it turned. Laura pointed to the carousel. "We need to check that. There might be something important there." We approached the carousel cautiously. The air around it was colder, and the sense of dread grew stronger. The figures on the carousel seemed to come alive in the flickering light, their eyes glowing with an unsettling, supernatural light. Tom reached out and touched one of the figures, a twisted, skeletal horse with a gaping, toothy grin. The moment his hand made contact, the carousel's music began to play. The melody was eerie and distorted, like it was being played backward on a warped record. The growling returned, louder and more frantic. It felt like the noise was coming from inside the carousel itself. We exchanged worried glances, but there was no turning back now. Mike, trying to stay calm, said, "Let's find out what's inside. Maybe there's a way out or a clue." We carefully lifted the dusty, broken panels of the carousel. Inside, we found a series of old, dusty compartments filled with faded, tattered carnival tickets and prizes. But beneath the tickets was something far more disturbing: a collection of old photographs. Each photo depicted people from various eras. Some were in old-fashioned clothes, others in more modern attire. They were all smiling, but their eyes were hollow and vacant. Among the photos was a faded, sepia-toned picture of a group of people. Jenna was among them, her face marked with a look of intense fear. The photo had an eerie, handwritten note on the back: "Forever trapped in the carousel's dance." Laura's hand trembled as she held up the photo. This is Jenna. How is she in this picture?" Before anyone could respond, the carousel's music grew louder and more discordant. The growling merged with the melody, creating an unsettling cacophony. The lights flickered and the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The carousel began to spin faster, its creaking and groaning growing louder. The figures on the carousel came to life, their grotesque features shifting and contorting as they moved. It felt like the carousel was alive, a malevolent entity with a hunger for souls. Suddenly, the lights went out again, plunging us into darkness. The growling was deafening, and we could feel the oppressive presence of the carousel surrounding us. We huddled together, trying to stay calm, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. A cold, slimy substance dripped onto my shoulder, and I recoiled in horror. The sensation was followed by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around us. "Join the dance." The lights flickered back on, and we saw that the room had changed once more. The carousel was gone, replaced by a twisted, nightmarish version of the carnival games we had seen earlier. The room was filled with shadows that seemed to move and shift, creating an ever-changing maze of darkness. We had no choice but to navigate through the shadowy maze, hoping to find Jenna and escape the nightmare. The growling was still present, though now it seemed to come from all directions, as if the entire maze was alive with malevolent intent. As we moved through the maze, we heard Jenna's voice again, faint and distorted. It was coming from deeper within the shadows. We followed the sound, our fear and desperation driving us forward. The shadows grew darker and more oppressive as we approached the source of the voice. The maze seemed to close in around us, the walls shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. We had to find Jenna before the darkness consumed us all. The maze of shadows seemed to stretch on forever, each turn revealing more of the dark, twisting labyrinth. The growling was now a constant, unsettling presence, echoing through the walls and making it hard to pinpoint its source. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and our breaths came in short, panicked bursts. We followed Jenna's distorted voice as best as we could, trying to ignore the creeping dread that settled in our bones. Every step felt like we were being watched, the shadows seeming to shift and writhe in response to our presence. Finally, we stumbled into a new room, a long, narrow corridor lined with rows of old carnival mirrors. This room, however, was different from the others. The mirrors here were not just broken or distorted, they were covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs. The reflections they cast were unsettlingly strange, showing not just our distorted figures, but also glimpses of nightmarish creatures lurking just out of sight. The sound of Jenna's voice was clearer here, coming from further down the corridor. It was both a relief and a torment, as the voice seemed to be taunting us, drifting away just as we thought we were getting closer. Laura glanced nervously at the mirrors. "These mirrors are giving me the creeps. It's like they're hiding something." Tom nodded. "We need to find Jenna quickly. Let's stick together and move fast." We moved cautiously down the corridor, our footsteps echoing off the mirrors. The voices in the reflections began to change, whispering incoherently and overlapping with the growling that filled the air. It was like being trapped in a hall of echoes, where every sound was distorted and unsettling. At one point, we passed a mirror that seemed to show a different scene altogether. It wasn't just reflecting our room, but appeared to be a view into another world, one that was dark, twisted, and filled with nightmarish figures. It was as if the mirror was a portal to some other, more horrifying reality. As we continued, the mirrors began to show more disturbing reflections. Some showed us as skeletal with hollow eyes staring back, while others displayed grotesque, shadowy figures lurking just behind us. The growling grew louder, and it felt like the presence was closing in on us. Suddenly, Laura screamed. We turned to see her staring at a mirror, her face pale with terror. The mirror showed a vision of Jenna, but she was trapped behind the glass, her face pressed against it, eyes wide with fear. "Jenna!" I shouted, reaching out toward the mirror. "We're here, we're coming for you." The image of Jenna in the mirror began to distort, her face stretching and warping as if it was being pulled away. The mirror cracked, and a cold, malevolent force surged through the cracks, pushing us back. We stumbled away from the mirror, our fear mounting as the growling grew deafening. The corridor seemed to be closing in around us, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. In the distance, we saw a faint light flickering, and we rushed toward it, hoping it would lead us to Jenna. As we approached, the corridor narrowed and twisted, creating a disorienting maze of reflections and shadows. The light led us to a large, ornate door at the end of the corridor. It was old and covered in strange, intricate carvings. The growling was louder than ever, and it felt like the door was the source of the malevolent force that had been tormenting us. We hesitated for a moment, but the sound of Jenna's voice, now desperate and pleading, pushed us forward. We pushed open the door and found ourselves in a large circular room with a high ceiling. The room was filled with shadows and strange, shifting shapes. In the center of the room was a massive, old-fashioned carnival tent, its fabric tattered and stained. The growling was now a roar, echoing through the room with a terrifying intensity. We had no choice but to enter the tent. As we did, the growling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, almost mocking silence. The interior of the tent was dark and filled with strange, unsettling objects, old carnival props, broken toys, and faded banners. In the center of the tent was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. The mirror's frame was intricately carved with disturbing, nightmarish imagery. The reflection it cast was not just of us, but of a distorted, shadowy version of the tent, one that seemed to be alive with malevolent energy. We could hear Jenna's voice again, now clearly coming from behind the mirror. It was clear she was close, but the mirror seemed to be the key to finding her. We had to figure out how to break through the mirror's illusions and rescue Jenna before it was too late. The tension was palpable as we prepared to face whatever horrors lay beyond the mirror's surface. We stood in front of the ornate mirror, its surface reflecting our anxious faces with an unsettling clarity. The growling had ceased, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the air with an eerie tension. Jenna's voice was now faint but clear, coming from somewhere behind the mirror. Laura, her eyes wide with determination, stepped forward. "We need to break this mirror somehow. Jenna's behind it, and it's the only way to get to her." Tom nodded, glancing at the mirror's frame. "Let's see if we can find a way to get through." We examined the mirror closely. The frame was carved with nightmarish imagery, twisting figures and grotesque faces that seemed to shift and writhe as we moved. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was something almost hypnotic about it, as if it was beckoning us to look closer. Mike, who had been silent and brooding, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe it's not just about breaking the mirror. Maybe it's about understanding it." His words seemed to resonate with the rest of us. We began to inspect the carvings more closely, trying to discern any clues that might help us. As we studied the mirror, we noticed that the carvings on the frame depicted a series of scenes, each one more disturbing than the last. There were images of people trapped in dark, twisted realms, their faces contorted in fear. Some scenes showed figures being pulled into the mirror, their bodies distorted and stretched. Laura's hand trembled as she traced one of the carvings. "These carvings? They look like they're telling a story. Maybe we need to follow the story to find a way through." We continued to examine the carvings, piecing together the narrative they depicted. It seemed to tell the story of a cursed carnival that trapped souls within its mirrors, a never-ending cycle of torment and despair. At the end of the story, there was an image of a figure breaking through the mirror, leading to a dark, swirling vortex. Tom pointed at the final carving. "This looks like it's showing how to break the curse. Maybe we need to do something similar to what's depicted here." With renewed determination, we searched the room for anything that could help us. There were old carnival props scattered around, broken toys, faded banners, and rusted metal objects. Among the debris, we found an old, rusted hammer. It was heavy and worn, but it looked like it might do the job. We positioned ourselves around the mirror, ready to strike. Laura and Mike held the mirror steady while Tom and I prepared to use the hammer. The eerie silence was broken only by the sound of our breaths and the faint, distant growling that seemed to echo from the walls. As we raised the hammer, Jenna's voice grew louder, filled with urgency and fear. "Please, hurry!" With a deep breath, we swung the hammer at the mirror. The glass shattered into a million pieces, the sound echoing through the room with a deafening crash. The mirror's surface was now a web of broken shards, each piece reflecting distorted fragments of our faces. As the mirror shattered, a swirling vortex of darkness appeared in the center of the frame. It was a dark, swirling maelstrom that seemed to pull everything toward it, a gateway to the nightmare world beyond. We hesitated for a moment, the sheer force of the vortex making it hard to approach. Jenna's voice was now clearer, coming from somewhere within the vortex. We could hear her cries for help, and it was clear that time was running out. "Let's go," I shouted, grabbing Laura's hand and pulling her toward the vortex. The others followed, their faces set with grim determination. As we stepped into the vortex, the darkness enveloped us, and we were pulled into a swirling, chaotic world. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, and the growling was now a constant, oppressive presence. The vortex seemed to stretch on forever, pulling us deeper into the nightmare. We emerged into a new world, a dark, twisted version of the carnival we had been exploring. The sky was a deep, blood-red hue, and the ground was covered in a thick, black mist. The carnival rides and games were twisted and grotesque, their colors dark and faded. Jenna's voice was louder now, coming from somewhere in the distance. We had to find her and escape this nightmarish realm before it was too late. The maze of twisted carnival rides and games loomed ahead, and we knew we had to navigate through it to find Jenna. The growling was now a constant roar, echoing through the mist and making it hard to see. The darkness was oppressive, and every step felt like we were being watched by unseen eyes. We pressed forward, determined to rescue Jenna and escape the nightmare. The twisted carnival awaited us, and the horrors that lay within were only beginning to reveal themselves. The twisted carnival loomed before us, its once familiar attractions now warped into horrifying versions of their former selves. The sky above was a turbulent mix of dark reds and purples, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The ground was shrouded in thick black mist that clung to our feet, making every step a struggle. The growling continued its relentless roar, reverberating through the mist and making it difficult to discern the direction of the sound. Jenna's voice was still faint, but seemed to be coming from somewhere within the depths of the carnival. We moved cautiously through the carnival, the twisted rides and games looming like dark sentinels. The Ferris wheel was a grotesque, skeletal structure, its rusted cars swaying eerily in the wind. The bumper cars were now nightmarish creatures with glowing, malevolent eyes, their movements jerky and unnatural. Laura stumbled over a discarded carnival prize, a once cheerful stuffed animal now grotesquely mutilated. The sight made her gag, and we paused for a moment to regain our composure. "We need to find Jenna quickly," Tom said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "She must be somewhere around here." We followed the sound of Jenna's voice, which seemed to lead us toward the center of the carnival. The mist grew thicker as we approached, and the growling grew louder, creating an oppressive atmosphere. As we reached the center of the carnival, we found ourselves in front of a massive, decrepit carousel. Unlike the one we had seen before, this carousel was much larger and more menacing. The horses and figures on it were grotesque, their forms twisted and distorted. The carousel spun slowly, emitting an eerie, discordant melody that seemed to resonate with the growling. Jenna's voice was now clearer, coming from somewhere near the carousel. "Help me, I'm here." We approached the carousel cautiously, the mist swirling around us. The carousel's music grew louder, and the figures on it seemed to come alive, their eyes following us with a malevolent gaze. Laura pointed to a small, hidden door at the base of the carousel. "That door. It might lead us to Jenna." We pried open the door and found a narrow, dark passage leading downward. The air was thick with an almost suffocating darkness, and the growling seemed to grow more intense. Taking a deep breath, we descended into the passage. The steps were uneven and treacherous, and the air grew colder with each step. Jenna's voice continued to echo through the passage, now filled with desperation. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a large underground chamber. The chamber was filled with twisted carnival props and broken toys, their once bright colors faded and distorted. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting eerie, distorted versions of ourselves. In the center of the chamber was a large, ornate mirror, similar to the one we had shattered earlier. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its frame was adorned with disturbing, nightmarish carvings. Jenna's voice was coming from behind the mirror. "Please help me, I'm trapped." We approached the mirror, but before we could figure out how to break through, the growling reached a deafening crescendo. The room seemed to shake, and the mirrors on the walls began to crack and shatter. From the shattered mirrors emerged dark, shadowy figures, twisted, nightmarish versions of ourselves. They moved with an unnatural grace, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figures began to advance toward us, their growling merging with the growling we had been hearing. "We need to hurry," I shouted, as the shadowy figures closed in. We scrambled to find a way to break through the mirror. Laura grabbed a nearby piece of broken carnival equipment, a rusty sledgehammer, and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered into a million pieces, and a swirling vortex of darkness appeared in the center of the frame. The shadowy figures were almost upon us, their growling and hissing filling the air. We had no choice but to step into the vortex, hoping it would lead us to Jenna and a way out of the nightmare. As we stepped into the vortex, the darkness enveloped us once again. The sensation was disorienting, as if we were being pulled through a maelstrom of shadows and distorted realities. The growling and hissing grew louder, merging into a cacophony of sound. We emerged into another realm, a twisted, chaotic version of the carnival we had seen before. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground was covered in a layer of black sludge. The carnival rides and games were even more grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing in the darkness. Jenna's voice was louder now, coming from somewhere within the twisted carnival. We had to find her and escape this nightmarish realm before it was too late. The new realm we entered was even more nightmarish than the previous one. The twisted carnival stretched out before us, a chaotic landscape of shifting forms and eerie lights. The sky was a sickly green, casting an unsettling glow over the ground, which was covered in a thick layer of black sludge that oozed and bubbled. Jenna's voice was clearer now, coming from somewhere deep within the maze of grotesque attractions. Her cries for help were filled with desperation, driving us forward despite the oppressive atmosphere and the ever-present growling. The carnival rides had become grotesque, their forms shifting and morphing in the flickering light. The Ferris wheel now spun with skeletal figures, their eyes glowing with malevolent energy. The bumper cars had turned into nightmarish creatures with jagged teeth and glowing eyes, their movements jerky and unpredictable. Laura, Tom, Mike, and I moved cautiously through the maze, trying to avoid the disturbing carnival games and rides that seemed to come alive as we passed. The mist that hung in the air grew thicker, and the growling grew louder, creating an almost tangible sense of dread. As we navigated the maze, we came across a series of old, dilapidated tents. Each tent was covered in faded, torn banners and was filled with unsettling carnival props. The shadows within the tents seemed to move on their own, and the growling echoed through the fabric walls. We entered one of the tents and found it filled with broken toys and old carnival prizes. In the center of the tent was a large, cracked mirror, its surface reflecting distorted, nightmarish versions of ourselves. The mirror's frame was covered in strange, shifting patterns that seemed to writhe and change as we moved. Mike pointed to a series of old carnival tickets scattered on the ground. These tickets, they look like they might be a clue. We picked up the tickets and examined them. Each ticket had strange symbols and patterns that seemed to match the shifting patterns on the mirror's frame. As we studied them, we realized that the symbols formed a pattern that matched a map of the carnival. "Look at this," Laura said, holding up a ticket with a strange symbol. "It matches the pattern on the mirror. Maybe we need to align the symbols to find the way out." We arranged the tickets according to the symbols and aligned them with the patterns on the mirror. As we did, the mirror's surface began to shimmer and change, revealing a hidden passage behind it. We entered the passage, which led us deeper into the maze. The walls were covered in dark, shifting shadows, and the growling grew louder and more intense. Jenna's voice was now almost deafening, coming from somewhere ahead. The passage opened into a large underground chamber. The chamber was filled with twisted carnival rides and broken props, their forms shifting and writhing in the darkness. In the center of the chamber was a large, ornate carnival tent, its fabric tattered and stained. Jenna's voice was coming from within the tent. "Please help me, I'm trapped." We approached the tent, but as we got closer, the growling reached a deafening roar. The tent's fabric began to writhe and twist as if something was trying to break free from within. Laura took a deep breath and pushed aside the fabric, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. Inside was a massive, ornate mirror, similar to the one we had shattered earlier. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of grime, and its frame was adorned with disturbing carvings. The growling was now a constant, oppressive presence, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. We could see Jenna's reflection in the mirror, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to break this mirror," Tom shouted over the noise. "It's the only way to get to Jenna." We grabbed the sledgehammer and took turns swinging it at the mirror. The glass shattered into a million pieces, and a swirling vortex of darkness appeared in the center of the frame. The vortex pulled us into its depths, and we were once again enveloped in darkness. The growling and hissing grew louder, merging into a cacophony of sound. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, pulling us deeper into the nightmare. We emerged into another realm, a dark, twisted version of the carnival we had seen before. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground was covered in a layer of black sludge. The carnival rides and games were even more grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing in the darkness. Jenna's voice was louder now, coming from somewhere within the twisted carnival. We had to find her and escape this nightmarish realm before it was too late. The twisted carnival stretched out before us, a nightmarish landscape of shifting shadows and grotesque attractions. The sickly green sky cast an unsettling glow over the black sludge-covered ground. Jenna's voice was clearer now, coming from somewhere deeper within the nightmare realm. Her cries for help were filled with desperation, pushing us forward despite the overwhelming dread. The carnival rides and games had become even more grotesque. The Ferris wheel was now a skeletal monstrosity, its rusted cars swaying ominously. The bumper cars had transformed into monstrous entities with glowing, malevolent eyes. The entire carnival seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. We navigated through the maze of twisted rides and games, the growling echoing louder and more intensely. The mist in the air grew thicker, and the shadows seemed to close in around us, creating a claustrophobic feeling. As we pressed on, we reached a large, ornate gate that led to a central area of the carnival. The gate was adorned with grotesque carvings and symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as we approached. Jenna's voice was now coming from beyond the gate, filled with terror and urgency. "We need to get through that gate!" Laura shouted, pointing to the heavy iron-bound entrance. "That's where Jenna is!" The gate was locked, its heavy chains and padlocks seemingly impenetrable. We searched the area for a way to open it, but the only thing we found was an old, rusted key lying on the ground. The key had strange symbols engraved on it, matching the symbols on the gate. Tom picked up the key and tried it in the lock. With a loud clank, the chains fell away and the gate creaked open. Beyond the gate was a large open area filled with eerie carnival tents and twisted rides. At the center of the area was a massive, ornate carousel, its horses and figures even more grotesque than before. The carousel spun slowly, emitting a discordant melody that seemed to resonate with the growling. Jenna's voice was now clearly coming from the carousel. We approached cautiously, our hearts pounding with fear. The carousel's music grew louder, and the figures on it seemed to come alive, their eyes glowing with malevolent energy. In front of the carousel was a large, ornate mirror similar to the ones we had encountered before. The mirror's surface was covered in grime, and its frame was adorned with disturbing carvings. Jenna's reflection was visible in the mirror, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror. The growling was now deafening, merging with the discordant carousel music to create a cacophony of sound. The shadows seemed to close in around us, and the entire area felt like it was being pulled into a maelstrom of darkness. "We need to break the mirror," I shouted over the noise. "It's the only way to reach Jenna." Laura grabbed the sledgehammer and took a deep breath. With a determined swing, she shattered the mirror. The glass exploded into a million pieces, and a swirling vortex of darkness appeared in the center of the carousel. The vortex pulled us into its depths, and we were once again enveloped in darkness. The growling and hissing grew louder, merging into a chaotic symphony of sound. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, pulling us deeper into the nightmare. We emerged into a final, desolate realm, a dark, twisted version of the carnival we had seen before. The sky was a sickly yellow, and the ground was covered in a layer of black sludge. The carnival rides and games were even more grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing in the darkness. In the center of this desolate realm was a massive, swirling vortex of shadows and light. Jenna's voice was now faint but clearly coming from within the vortex. We had to find her and escape the nightmare before it was too late. We moved cautiously toward the vortex, the growling and hissing reaching a deafening roar. The shadows seemed to close in around us, and the darkness was almost suffocating. As we reached the vortex, we saw Jenna's reflection within it, her face filled with relief and hope. With a final, desperate effort, we stepped into the vortex, hoping to find a way out of the nightmare realm. The darkness enveloped us once again, and the growling and hissing grew louder. The vortex seemed to stretch on forever, pulling us deeper into the chaos. But as we pressed forward, we felt a glimmer of hope, the hope that we would finally escape the nightmare and rescue Jenna. As the darkness began to recede, we emerged into a new realm, one that was strangely familiar, yet different. The carnival was gone, replaced by a quiet, serene landscape. The sky was clear and the ground was covered in soft grass. The nightmare realm had vanished, and we were finally free. Jenna was there, safe and sound, her face filled with gratitude and relief. We had escaped the nightmare and rescued her, but the memories of the twisted carnival and the horrors we had faced would stay with us forever. The nightmare was over, but the echoes of the carnival's horrors would haunt us for a long time to come.